Not all writing tips are created equally. Following the wrong advice or applying good advice in a bad way can be devastating for your novel. So to help you avoid that, today we're going to talk about some writing tips that could ruin your novel should they be applied in a haphazard way. Starting with the advice to stop writing introspection or navel gazing. There are, depending on who you ask, either 4 or 5 parts to prose. You've got dialogue, which is characters talking to each other. You've got narrative, which is the actions and stuff happening in the story. You've got description, which describes what stuff looks, tastes, and smells like. And you have introspection, which is basically what the characters think and their reactions to various things that are happening. The 5th one that sometimes people add is exposition, which is backstory, world building stuff, but we're not talking about that one. We're talking about introspection. Introspection, also called navel gazing, is any part of the story that has characters just sort of sitting there thinking about stuff. The typical advice that you'll encounter is to avoid introspection, that you should focus on action, dialogue, description, everything except having characters sit there and ruminate on their situation. This is good advice on the surface, but a novel completely devoid of introspection is going to feel flat, and it's going to be more difficult to develop your characters. I think why this advice is so often given is that a lot of new writers especially, spend way too much time on character rumination and having characters just sitting there thinking about stuff. They write scenes that would probably be better written as action or dialogue exchanges, but a lot of people feel it's easier to write them as character rumination scenes, so that's what they do. A better way to frame this advice is to not write too much introspection. A little bit of introspection here and there, especially if it's surrounded by action, is perfectly fine. Having bigger rumination scenes can also work. Now, this tends to work better later on in the story once the characters are more developed, once the reader has developed relationships with the characters. That's when they work better, not early on when we aren't as familiar with the characters. Categorically saying that all introspection scenes, that all rumination is bad is just not correct. Some of it, when applied in the right areas, can work quite well. Next up, advice number 2 that can lead to bad things when applied in a bad way: kill your darlings. Writing fiction requires dealing with a lot of difficult things, and chief among those difficult things is that a lot of the things you have written that you like are ultimately going to need to be cut. Whether it's a scene that just doesn't work, a character that doesn't work no matter how you change them, or even an entire novel that just does not work. You, as a writer, are going to spend a lot of time cutting things that you love. You are going to kill a lot of your darlings. Your writing darlings, not anything else. Don't misinterpret that. But taking this attitude too far can result in you writing something that you lack passion for. I think a lot of writers risk misunderstanding this advice and taking it to mean that what you write shouldn't be something that you enjoy, and that you should steer clear of anything that brings you any sort of pleasure. This attitude of constantly cutting, and if you fall in love with something, it means that it's ultimately detrimental to your story, when taken too far, is just going to cut everything good out of your novel. There's elements of truth to this advice because other people aren't necessarily going to enjoy the same things that you enjoy. There's the commercialization aspect of things if you want to ultimately publish. And your emotions and attachments will make you love something more than it probably deserves to be loved. You can't always objectively assess the quality of a piece of writing if you yourself are emotionally attached to it in some way. And it's becoming emotionally attached to bad scenes or bad characters that often means they need to be cut. But there still needs to be some spark of passion. You still need to enjoy what you're writing on some level. So taking this advice of killing your darlings too far can ultimately be detrimental. Sometimes your passion or interest in a specific character or a specific idea is enough to turn it into something that's actually good. So be careful about what you cut from your novel. Next up, piece of advice number 3 centers around actively trying to find your voice, or otherwise expending any effort to craft your voice. Every writer will eventually find their own voice, those parts of their style that set them apart from other writers, whether it's the overall approach to a story, your word choice, or just the view you have on humanity and the world. A lot of writers in the early stages of writing, myself included, get very concerned about finding this voice, about carving out their own unique style. But finding your voice is less about consciously doing things and more about tearing things away. Strunk and White talk about this in The Elements of Style. I know we recently talked about this book on the channel here, which is why it was still on my desk here. They actually mentioned something about finding your voice, if I can find what they say about finding your voice. So this is point 1 under the approach to style section, and it says, place yourself in the background. Write in a way that draws the reader's attention to the scene and substance of the writing rather than to the mood and temper of the author. If the writing is solid and good, the mood and temper of the writer will eventually be revealed and not at the expense of the work. As you become proficient in the use of language, your style will emerge because you yourself will emerge, and when this happens, you will find it increasingly easy to break through the barriers that separate you from other minds, other hearts, which is, of course, the purpose of writing. Your voice will become an emergent property of your writing once you carve away everything that stands between you and clarity. Trying to force elements into your style or trying to mimic another author can help with experimenting, but ultimately voice is not something that you craft. It's something that appears once you get good enough. The next piece of advice that can be problematic when poorly applied: show don't tell. I don't have problems with this specific advice, but rather with the specificity of this advice. Show don't tell is 100% correct. There are arguments around nuance and specifics that we could get into, but it is ultimately good advice that all writers should follow. However, it's not very specific, and that's where the advice breaks down. Telling a writer to show don't tell is like telling a doctor that they should heal sick people, or that a mason should build walls, or that a taxi driver should drive a taxi. It's like, yes, that's true. It's a thing those people should do, but there's not enough depth to that advice to actually be helpful. Writing advice exists on a spectrum. On one end, you have these vague but very true, very principled ideas like show don't tell. And on the other end, you have very specific, actionable advice like you would get from an editor or a critique partner. This is specific to your writing, actual concrete things that you can shift around in what you've written to improve it. There's that stuff, there's the vague stuff, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in between as you move from the vague to the specific. Trying to apply a big vague idea like show don't tell to your writing may lead you astray. Those big vague conceptual ideas need to be broken down into more specific ideas. You need to take these broad ideas about how to write good fiction and distill them down to what applies to the specific novel that you are writing. And this needs to be combined with actionable advice that you get from critique partners and the like. Part of learning to write better, part of understanding what goes into good writing is finding elements of those vague ideas in the writing that you create or the writing that you read and distilling them down into more specifics. You can't learn what you need to learn if all you consume are these big, broad, vague ideas. And the last piece of advice that can lead to unintended consequences if applied incorrectly, that is the advice to write every day. There is a very compelling case for all writers, especially new writers, to get as much practice at the craft as possible. Practice is the single biggest driver to improvement, and more practice, up to a given point, is better. You will see a lot of people advocate that you should write every day. And while this fits into the more is better paradigm, it's not universally true. If you only have time to write on the weekends, or if you work writing into your weekday routine in some way, and that's all you can do, that's totally fine. You do not need to practice every single day of the week. Part of this has to do with your own personal schedule, the other stuff and commitments you have. Part of it also has to do with how you like to structure your practice sessions. Some people do better with longer sessions, which means a dedicated afternoon on Saturday or Sunday to write might be better than spending a quick half hour every single day of the week. Other people like shorter, quicker sessions. You have to experiment and figure out what works best for you. Different writers will benefit from different cadences to their practice. So saying that everyone universally 100% of the time should write every single day is just not true. While there's some romance to this idea of writing every single day, it is by no means practical for everyone to do that, and ultimately I don't think it's necessary. Forcing yourself into a routine that doesn't benefit you is not going to benefit you. Just like this video. No, wait, I got that backwards, I think. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, please check out all my other writing advice related videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.